airfield in sight, runway in sight.
Two pilots within a few feet of making a safe landing crash short of the runway in Colombia.
Our #1 priority was the passengers and getting everyone to safety.
The 737 broke apart upon hitting the ground.
Investigators search for a possible cause, but find no useful evidence.
And we still can't explain why.
It's not until they scrutinize the entire chain of events that they finally catch a break.
That's it. What?
Climb, Captain!
Just after midnight, Aries Flight 8250 is carrying a plane load of tourists and locals from Bogota to the small Colombian island of San Andres, an ocean playground in the Caribbean Sea.
So much for grabbing dinner on the ground.
Yeah, it's gonna be a late night.
Captain Wilson Gutierrez is a veteran pilot with almost 20 years of flying experience.
At least we're finally up in the air.
First Officer Camilo Piñeros has flown for Aries for 3 years, with a full year on the airline's new Boeing 737s.
Looks like there's some weather ahead of us.
Let's keep an eye on it.
There are signs of a thunderstorm in the distance. For the next hour and 30 minutes, the 737 will fly northwest to San Andres at a cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Passengers are restless after an unexpected 4-hour delay getting off the ground.
We should be landing just before 2 a.m.
Flight attendant Adriana Cardenas Medina is working hard to settle passengers, many heading to the small island for a holiday.
The flight was running late because it was coming from Cali, and it was late due to poor weather. They said it was running 2 hours behind, but it actually ended up being twice that.
Just over 40 minutes into the flight, the captain sees the storm clouds ahead are building.
Airlines operate 24 hours a day, so pilots fly in all kinds of conditions, both daylight, dark, good weather, bad weather. As a professional pilot, you deal with these environmental challenges constantly.
Prior to beginning our descent into San Andres, we began to experience some light turbulence.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts.
It was raining. There was lightning, a lot of lightning, and the turbulence started to intensify.
Now past the halfway point of the trip. The captain is increasingly concerned with the possibility of heavy storms gathering over their destination.
It doesn't look like we're gonna get any relief from this storm.
Yeah, lots of activity tonight.
Closer to San Andres, the already bumpy ride is getting worse and worse for the passengers.
Normally you go through a patch and then it stops. In this instance, there was lightning bolt after lightning bolt, and the plane shook hard and the turbulence would not stop.
Check it out, Camilo. It's building all around the island. Can this bad weather be in San Andreas?
Less than 20 minutes away from the airport, the weather on the ground appears to be changing rapidly.
Get a report from San Andreas for me.
Okay, I'll ask.
The San Andres air traffic controller is also keeping a close eye on changes to the weather.
San Andres, good morning. Itis 8250.
Go ahead.
We want to know how the weather is at the airport, please.
Okay, Air 8250. Wind calm, visibility more than 10 kilometers, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet. There's some bad weather near the airfield, but right now there's no rain.
Despite the turbulent weather along the way, conditions in San Andres seem to be much better.
Air 8250, descend 3,000 feet, clear for approach, runway 06.
Roger, continue descending to 3,000.
In the cabin, passengers are growing concerned by the intensity of the storm.
This shouldn't last long.
We told them that we were in an intense weather system and that we would be out of it shortly, but we never actually got out of it.
Air 8250, there is a thunderstorm over the airport right now.
Okay, Roger, thank you.
Gear down.
Air 8250, there's a little drizzle over the runway.
A little what?
Drizzle.
Ah. Okay, give him the announcement.
Cabin clear to their stations for landing.
Please reach your table.
As the storm continues to build, Aries 8250 is about to begin its final approach.
Okay, flaps 5.
Wet runway, 3 on the auto brake.
Let's leave it on 2.
The crew configures the plane for landing. The weather in San Andres is changing fast.
Air 8250, there's now heavy rain at the airfield and visibility reduced to 5 kilometers.
Visibility down to 5 kilometers.
Oh, man.
When you see particularly weather that's deteriorating, it causes you to be a little bit more cautious because the trend is not going in a positive direction.
The rain became even more intense, the turbulence more intense, and the thunder was more frequent.
In deteriorating conditions and just 7 miles from landing, the captain confirms the procedure in the event they have to abort the landing at the last minute.
In case we miss the approach, we go right, correct?
Yes, correct, sir.
As you get closer to your destination and you start getting the latest weather, the thing that you're thinking about is, okay, how are we going to position the airplane to land in these conditions? And if we don't land, what are we going to do next?
Only minutes away from landing, the pilots run through their final checks.
Landing checklist.
Speed brakes,
Armed.
landing gear,
Down.
flaps,
30.
checklist complete.
We were about 5 minutes from landing. I started to see lights in the ocean from the island.
But less than 2.5 minutes from touchdown, visibility has reduced dramatically.
Air 8250, do you have the runway in sight?
Negative.
Not yet.
Seconds later,
Airfield in sight, runway in sight. Itis 8250.
the clouds over San Andres lift.
Insight landing.
Check, we're all set for landing.
500 feet from the ground, the crew spots the runway. The captain lines up his plane.
Air 8250, winds at 60 degrees at 15 knots.
Then the wind picks up.
50 knots, head on. In case of wind shear, we use maximum thrust for a go-around. Don't touch flaps or gear.
Agreed, yes, sir.
Caught in a sudden deluge, visibility decreases again.
Look out, Captain.
The first officer now realizes they are too low to make a safe landing.
Can you make it?
line, Captain!
The captain pulls back on his control column, but it's too late.
We felt a hard and sudden crash.
At 1:47 a.m., Ares 8250 slams into the ground with 131 passengers and crew on board.
There's been an accident.
Ares 8250 has crashed just short of touchdown in San Andres and broken into 3 pieces. Inside the front section of the airplane, flight attendant Adriana Cardenas Medina has survived the horrific crash.
Are you okay?
Bruised and battered, passengers near the front start lining up towards the aircraft's main door and the emergency slide. But now a new problem. The main exit door is jammed.
My coworker and I tried to open the door, but it would not open. A passenger helped us to open it.
The flight attendants work as quickly as possible to get all 125 passengers off the plane.
Our #1 priority was the passengers and getting everyone to safety. So we were all focused on that.
In the aftermath of the recovery, 1 passenger is dead after being hit in the chest by a tray table. A second passenger who was severely injured on impact dies in hospital 2 weeks later.
When you think of boarding an aircraft, you imagine leaving it in the same manner. Not forcibly or in pain, fear, frustration. It's something you can never imagine happening.
The crash and destruction of Flight 8250 is quickly becoming a major international news story.
A plane crash this morning in Colombia. The 737 broke apart upon hitting the ground.
The Colombian Aeronautical Authority needs to find out what brought down one of the most widely used passenger planes on Earth. Investigator Julian Echeverri is one of the first investigators on the scene.
Huh. Broken into 3 pieces. He was definitely lined up for a landing.
From the orientation of the wreckage, investigators can tell that Flight 8250 was lined up perfectly with the runway at San Andres.
When
we first looked at the debris, we observed that the initial impact was approximately 40 meters from the start of runway 06. It was a low-angle impact at a relatively high speed.
Very quickly, both the flight data and cockpit voice recorders are recovered.
Excellent work. Let's hope they provide some answers.
But until the recordings can be analyzed, investigators will need to rely on the wreckage at the crash site to explain the cause of the accident. The team studies the debris trail that extends 160 feet from the runway's threshold.
Landing gear extended. Snapped off. Lined up and configured, but somehow they hit the ground hard, meters from the runway.
Investigators can't understand why the jet got so close to the runway, but ended up short. While wreckage crews transport the debris to a nearby facility for analysis, Investigators wonder what role the severe weather played in the accident.
What if the storm brought them down?
The team studies meteorological reports from the night of the crash.
Era una gran hipótesis que teníamos también dentro de todo.
The meteorological condition during the accident was one of the things we considered in this investigation.
Existían meteorológicamente hablando al momento del accidente.
Based on the first information that we received. Turn that up, would you?
La primera información que tenemos es que aparentemente un rayo
A lightning bolt struck the
sobre el
airplane
avión y
and caused the tragedy that we're all aware of. They're saying it's lightning? We'll see.
Echeverri and his team know that accidents caused by lightning are virtually unheard of.
Lightning strikes, although they're very spectacular and can visually impair you just with that bright flash, they really don't pose a great threat to the airplane during landing.
Investigators need to know if there was lightning near the 737 as it approached San Andres.
There was video evidence from a closed-circuit television camera which recorded the final moments prior to the accident.
Sure looks like lightning. The timing fits.
Se observaba un destello muy grande.
There was a big flash in the video, which led us to think that the aircraft could have been struck by lightning.
Alcanzada por una descarga eléctrica.
The team studies the static wicks from the accident plane. Static wicks are located on the trailing edges of airplane wings and help discharge any buildup of static energy.
If the plane was struck by lightning, they should be melted or burned.
But they are not. Investigators can find no signs of a direct lightning hit on the aircraft's surfaces.
During the inspection of the debris, which was carefully performed, we found no traces of interaction with lightning.
They're clean.
But Echeverri still has a lot of unanswered questions about the weather at the time of the accident.
Looks like it was a big storm.
Las condiciones en las que la aeronave...
The conditions in which the aircraft interacted with the terrain before arriving at runway 06 raised the possibility of an encounter with wind shear in that last minute.
En ese último minuto con un wind shear.
Wind shear is a phenomenon in which the wind's direction or speed changes extremely abruptly.
60-degree winds at 15 knots. The wind was picking up.
Could intense winds at the base of the runway have played a role in the crash?
We need to look at wind shear.
The team learns that just 2 minutes before the crash, as the storm built, winds near the runway were gusting. Digging further into the flight data.
So, lots of headwind, but almost no downdraft.
Investigator Julian Echeverri discovers the powerful winds were hitting the plane head-on, not from above.
Not enough to slam them to the ground.
El momento del aterrizaje de ese último instante.
During the landing, there was an increase in wind speed, but in this case, it was a horizontal increase. There was no trace in the flight data of a vertical change of wind that would have caused the aircraft to lose altitude.
Cambio en el viento, en este caso, hecho perder al cierto tipo de altitud en la aeronave como tal.
All investigators uncover is a moderate headwind at the time of the crash. A discovery that leads nowhere.
So we'll rule out weather for now.
El hecho que no pudiese haber sido un wind shear, que esa era la hipótesis que más...
The fact that it was not wind shear made us focus on operational aspects that may have led to this accident.
En observar los aspectos operacionales que condujeron a este accidente como tal.
What about the aircraft itself?
Investigators now wonder if an engine malfunction led to the crash of Ares Flight 8250.
The blades are bent in the opposite direction of the rotation.
That tells investigator Julian Echeverri that the engines were working when they hit the ground.
Let's move on.
Measurements of the flap settings show they were in the correct position for landing.
Okay, flaps 5.
Wet runway, 3 on the auto brake.
Let's leave it on 2.
Flaps right where they should be.
In fact, investigators find nothing to indicate a mechanical cause for the crash of Ares 8250.
Se observaron las superficies de control de vuelo.
We observed the flight control surfaces. We observed the flap configuration, the cockpit switches.
Engines, rudder, control surfaces, you name it, they all check out.
There weren't any system malfunctions or engine or GPS problems that would have caused the aircraft to land before the start of the runway.
Lieutenant Colonel Ever Sabogal from the Colombian Air Force joins the investigative team.
The conditions that they had, conditions of extremely bad weather, a particularly dark night. They had a lot of lightning all around them, and they were feeling pressure to land.
Were they prepared to land in these stormy conditions?
Investigators now need to find out if the storm took the pilots by surprise. If it did, that might have led them to make errors in their approach.
The critical part is what's the weather going to be when we get there. It's less critical of what it is right now. So as you get very close to the airport, that's when you want to make sure that you have a good understanding of the weather that you're about to deal with in the final approach segment of the flight.
Can I show you this?
The team already knows the weather was changing quickly just before the crash. But they need to determine if the air traffic controller kept them up to date.
I updated them regularly once a week in my airspace.
San Andres, good morning. IDIS 8250.
Go ahead.
We want to know how the weather is at the airport, please.
Okay, Airs 8250. Wind calm, visibility more than 10 kilometers, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet. There's some bad weather near the airfield, but right now there's no rain. Every time the weather changed, even a bit, I told them.
Gear down.
Airs 8250, there's a little drizzle over the runway.
A little what?
Drizzle.
Minutes later, it turned into a full-blown storm.
Airs 8250, there's now heavy rain at the airfield and visibility reduced to 5 kilometers.
Did they seem concerned about the weather?
No, they didn't sound overly concerned. I was very careful to tell them everything.
The controllers are very good about reading up changing weather conditions, particularly wind and visibility, which is the two most critical factors as they get very close to the airport. But the decision to land or not to land rests with the captain. And he or she is responsible to make the decision whether the conditions are safe to land or not.
Airs 8250, do you have the runway in sight?
Negative.
Not yet. Airfield in sight, runway in sight. IDIS 8250.
And this is appropriate because it's really only the pilots that can see the exact conditions that the airplane is in and the visibility they have to be able to see the runway and land safely on it.
Look out, Captain!
Investigators now have the flight data from Ares Flight 8250.
The digital flight data recorder records hundreds or thousands of different parameters, and it tells you everything that the airplane's doing, whether the landing gear's up or down, the altitude, airspeed, and numerous other functions of the systems within the airplane.
The team is looking for clues that might indicate how the pilots handled the plane in the thunderstorm.
Here, 45 minutes before reaching the airport, they switched to vertical speed mode.
That's a questionable choice.
The investigators noticed that the pilots selected an autopilot mode called vertical speed.
Estimate to 50%, 3,000 feet, clear for approach runway 06.
In vertical speed mode, the crew must manually select their rate of descent.
This mode requires a lot of work because you have to be constantly calculating your altitude versus your distance.
The Boeing procedures are typically to utilize automation, use the autopilot during approaches, particularly in bad weather. For these pilots to have reverted to a manual system where they turn the autopilot off is against the Boeing recommendation.
Investigators check the plane's rate of descent.
Look at this. They were descending to the runway at 1,100 feet per minute.
According to the manufacturer, rate of descent shouldn't exceed 900 feet per minute.
It's an important clue.
If they are in excess of 1,000 feet per minute, then it is unstable approach.
The team has now determined the plane was dropping too fast, and they have a theory as to why.
They must have been trying to get a visual fix of the runway as soon as possible.
By bringing the airplane down early, the hope is that you'll see the runway earlier. You'll be underneath the clouds, and your visibility will be improved the lower you get.
But that strategy didn't work for the crew of the Aries flight. The question is, why not? The investigators can now compare the approach the crew should have flown to the one they actually did fly.
They should have stayed on the glide path.
But instead, they come in too low the entire way.
And they didn't even try to get back on the glide path.
He played instead the entire time with the vertical speed. They didn't have an angle or a constant path, and that made it so that they were always below it. They were never on the right path for the type of approach that they made.
Didn't they know they were coming in too low?
Wouldn't the PAPI lights have told them that?
PAPI lights, or Precision Approach Path Indicators, are color-coded lights along the side of the runway that tell pilots if they are too high or too low on their approach. The airport's PAPI lights were fully operational that night, yet the plane still came in low.
Why would a person operating an aircraft make that type of approach, even when the visual aids are indicating the correct path to the runway?
Mantenga una senda correcta para la pista.
The team hopes the cockpit voice recorder can provide answers to all their unanswered questions. They focus on the final approach.
Landing checklist. Speed brakes. Armed. Landing gear.
Down.
Flaps. 30. Checklist complete.
We're too low.
President 250, do you have the runway in sight?
Negative.
Not yet. Airway in sight, runway in sight, IDIS 8250. In sight landing. Check, we're all set for landing.
Stop. Did you catch that? Go back 30 seconds.
Checklist complete. We're too low.
President 250, do you have the runway in sight?
Stop. The captain realizes they're below the glide path, but there's no discussion about it. No go-around.
They just keep going.
Why? Continue.
On the final approach, the captain simply continues to fly, focused on trying to reach the runway.
15 knots, head on. In case of wind shear, we use maximum thrust for a go-around. Don't touch flaps or gear.
Agreed, yes, sir.
Everything sounds okay?
Look out, Captain.
40, 30, 20.
Climb, Captain!
First officer knows something isn't right.
But the captain doesn't respond.
Why not?
The investigation finally has a solid lead to follow. Investigators are baffled by the captain's actions on board Flight 8250. They question him about what happened on the approach to San Andres.
I didn't think anything went wrong until the crash. It was stormy. It must have been the lightning or the wind.
Nunca cuestionan el tipo de aproximación que hicieron.
They never questioned the type of approach that they made. They never doubted that their procedure was adequate. And they said it was probably the wind that caused their accident.
Probablemente fue el viento el que ocasionó el accidente.
But when the captain is asked about his use of the PAPI lights, his answer provides the first big break in the investigation.
I'm not sure what the PAPI lights were showing. I was focused on the green lights at the threshold, like I always do.
Airfield in sight, runway in sight. IDIS 8250.
In-sight landing.
Check, we're all set for landing.
Ellos estaban concentrados.
They were concentrated on the green lights at the start of the runway, and they ignored the information of the PAPI lights.
De las luces PAPI.
Instead of landing in the touchdown zone, which is here, the captain says that he always lands here on the threshold.
Se vio recurrentemente en sus registros ciertas técnicas.
We noticed in his statement a recurring flight technique that involved pointing the nose of the aircraft at the runway for approaches and landings.
Nariz hacia la cabecera de la pista.
The thinking of some pilots has been, I want on the runway as early as possible so that I can make sure that we get stopped if there's a problem with the brakes. So they deliberately land short of the touchdown zone.
Possibly, that's what the pilot was doing the whole time, looking for the green lights and trying to make it.
Investigators ask the captain why he performed the landing this way.
That's my training. I was just doing what we've always done.
Se dio una...
We saw that the crew decided to make an approach using their own criteria, not the criteria recommended by the manufacturer.
Por fuera de lo que se está estableciendo por el fabricante.
Investigators need to know what led the crew to do this. They dig into their background.
Check this out. He's only been flying a 737 for 8 months.
12 years before that, he flew turboprops.
The file reveals that Captain Gutierrez recently switched from commanding Dash 8 turboprops to the much larger 737 jets. The discovery provides a new clue.
That's it.
What?
He was flying like he was in a turboprop.
Not a 737.
The investigators found that the higher rate of descent that they flew in the 737 was much more like the profile that you would expect in the turboprop that they had flown previously.
Al acumular uno muchísima experiencia.
In accumulating so much experience in the turboprops, you develop habits, and when one translates this to the cockpit of jets, one starts to battle with all the tools that make your trip secure.
Que te hacen el vuelo seguro.
We got to find out if these guys were properly trained to fly a 737.
Ares started as a small regional airline flying turboprops around central Colombia. Then in 2009, the year before the crash, Ares underwent a huge expansion, adding 9 737s to its fleet. Normally, the industry practice is to hire experienced 737 pilots to fly the new jets. But that's not what Ares did.
Okay, thanks very much. They didn't hire any new pilots for the 737s. They just transitioned the turboprop pilots into them.
That's a big leap.
In turboprops, everything is much easier. It's a slower plane. It reacts faster. It raises up easily. A turboprop is very forgiving. A jet doesn't forgive.
What did Ares do to safely transition their pilots onto the new 737s? The investigators take a closer look at the crew's training records.
The captain switched over to a 737 after only 5 weeks of training.
First officer only trained for 2 weeks.
The team concludes the pilots didn't have enough training to properly prepare them to fly the 737.
Lo más importante de la transición es desarraigar.
The most important thing about the transition is to undo those concepts that one has of flying turboprops and really just start over. Jets are planes that require a lot of anticipation. They require a lot of concentration. They require you to understand what a computer is doing.
Requiere entender lo que está haciendo un computador.
Investigators now conclude the captain likely reverted back to his turboprop habits while trying to land at the San Andres airport.
So just as he would in a turboprop, he aims for the threshold.
But he crashes short of that.
And we still can't explain why.
Investigators now know that the captain of Ares 8250 was purposely trying to land his airplane on the threshold of the runway.
Inside landing. Check, we're all set for landing.
The same way he used to land in a turboprop.
500. Air 3250 winds at 60 degrees at 15 knots.
50 knots, head on.
But that still doesn't explain why the crew crashed short of the runway. The last piece of the puzzle is elusive. The investigators listen to the cockpit recording once more, hoping to hear something they missed.
Look out, Captain. Can you make it? Climb, Captain!
So from the point he gets a visual of the runway, the captain does nothing to correct his altitude, right up to the crash.
Not even when the first officer gives him warnings.
So what's going on in his head?
When the investigators looked at the flight profile and they realized that it ended up impacting the ground short of the runway without ever really arresting itself and trying to hop up to the runway or make power adjustments until the very last minute. The next question is, what is this consistent with? This is a classic undershoot accident in just about every sense. It's a classic black hole illusion accident.
The black hole illusion occurs on dark nights when there are no ground lights between an airplane and the runway threshold. The contrast between the lights and the total darkness creates an illusion that deceives pilots into thinking the runway is closer than it really is, causing them to put the plane down too early.
This creates the visual illusion like in a black hole, where you completely lose your depth perception.
It was a nighttime approach on an island with no noticeable difference between land and water. And only the runway lights as reference. When doing this manually and visually, the risk for entering a black hole illusion increases.
You have rain causing poor visibility, some lights on the right, very few. The runway lights, that's about it. It's a black hole illusion.
In case of wind shear, we use maximum thrust for a go-around. Don't touch flaps or gear.
Agreed, yes, sir.
In this case, the black hole effect was made worse by another effect that was generated by the lights of the aircraft with the rain. Why? Because when the lights of the plane go on, you start to see the rain falling. The wipers start up, and they also distract you. And the brain has to play with all that and be able to identify where the runway is.
You take all the problems the Ares 8250 had, and it still doesn't necessarily give you a plane crash. But throw a black hole in there, and it makes sense.
The black hole illusion is the final piece of the puzzle.
That's why the crew was constantly below the flight path, without being aware of it, and they never made it to the runway.
Y nunca llegaron a la pista.
The Colombian Aeronautical Authority issues a series of recommendations, including a revision of Ares Airlines procedures for visual landings.
In this accident, there is no one reason. There are many reasons that brought them to this. The type of approach, the kind of training.
El tipo de entrenamiento.
Can you make it?
Una de las recomendaciones
I think one of the most important recommendations from this investigation was strengthening crew training, especially for those transitioning from turboprop to jet.
Turboprops y avionaves jet.
For flight attendant Adriana Cardenas Medina, the memory of the doomed flight still haunts her.
My life became a struggle. I was left with irreparable physical injuries and with psychological trauma, which I will probably never fully overcome. What I experienced was outside of the norm and was totally devastating.
Desesperante.
For investigators, the crash of Ares 8250 is a cautionary tale about the dangers of an undertrained crew.
La recomendación más importante que apuntaba a
The most important recommendation we gave was about ensuring and strengthening the crew training
para que esto sea una defensa
and following manufacturers' instructions so that they can prevent these types of accidents.